Hi, I'm Melotik. I'm an engineer with AECOM, and we work on behalf of the city of Verona for all their water and soil erosion engineering. Tonight, we're going to be talking about salting and how that impacts the environment and what we can do to help. So just to start off, looking at the big picture of everything, something close to home, the Yahara chain of lakes have seen pretty dramatic chloride increases over the years. Um, as you can see, pretty much from the mid 50s up until now, there's just been a steady increase of chloride concentrations at a rate of about 1 milligram per liter per year, which is quite a bit. Per the DNR, once you reach about 400 milligrams per liter per year, that's when you start seeing some chronic impacts to wildlife and other plant life as well. This is mainly because chloride does not break down very easily in the environment. Pretty much once it's there, it gets stuck there. There is no really easy way to clean it up either. The only way you can really clean it up is with reverse osmosis, which is a very expensive technology that pretty much uses a membrane to keep water on one side and then the chlorides and other ions on the other side. But since it's so expensive, it's really not practical. So really our best bet is to just keep the salt and the chlorides from entering the water in the first place. So 395 milligrams per liter might sound like quite a lot, but that's not something that you'd really notice if you're just walking into a lake or something like that. Salt water, for reference, is about 100 times as potent as that. And we all know that salt water, you can tell, you can feel it, you can smell it. If you just run into 400 milligrams per liter, you're not going to be able to tell. So without testing, it's really hard to figure out where the issues are. Other than surface water, obviously, we have groundwater impacts too. So in Wisconsin and Minnesota, a large number of residents get groundwater as their daily usage water. So either that's from city wells or private wells. In Wisconsin specifically, 2/3 of people get their water from wells. And it does help buffer that chloride impact from the groundwater. So it'll get caught up in the soil and the bedrock before it gets into your well. But as you can see with the graph there, it does still get there and there are still concentrations. So just to explain that graph there, the left 3 items are from the lower parts of the aquifer, and that's where the testing was done. The right 3 bars are from the upper and lower, so it gives a more representative sample of the groundwater table. So as you can see, it's getting down all the way through the aquifer, but in the upper end, there's much higher concentrations. So generally with like a municipal well or a really deep private well, you're not going to really see many issues with chloride concentrations because it's getting hung up higher in the aquifer. But with shallower wells, that is still common in Wisconsin. You'll possibly get those impacts of higher chloride levels. Again, you're not going to really notice this until you have it tested, but there can still be health impacts. And per the EPA, they have a secondary standard of 250 milligrams per liter as the concentration that once it's above it, you're looking at health impacts. This isn't enforceable federally, but it's still just a general health guideline. So while really most of the testing shows that it's not even close to that level yet, it's still something to be aware of. There's other negative impacts, as we all know, rust on our cars, chipping the roads, bridges, other corrosion in the environment too. Per WisconsinSaltWise.com, The US spends about $5 billion a year just on salt damage to roads and bridges. And that's not including your car, that's not including lamp posts, it's not including anything like that. That's just public roads and bridges are $5 billion a year from salt impacts. And then for pets and other animals, if you're taking your dog for a walk, it could get cut on the salt crystals that are left out. There's also other health impacts with seizures, cardiac events, things like that as well that can happen from being dehydrated, getting that salt absorbed into their bodies. And then this was a good example that I found while looking for other animal impacts as well, is there's many amphibians that just simply cannot survive once levels get to a certain point. The example was 200 milligrams per liter was the level that you typically don't find any more amphibians after that level. For spotted salamanders specifically, their embryonic survival decreases by 32% once you get to 145 milligrams per liter, which is only about half a teaspoon in a 5-gallon bucket. So it does not take very much for these impacts to be felt by wildlife. So moving on to winter salt applications and municipal salting, residential salting as well. Just some history, so we get some background. In the 1940s, Wisconsin pretty much only used sand for winter road treatments. But later in the 40s, they began to use rock salt with this as well to help melt the ice. And then since that worked so well, they moved in the 50s to just rock salt instead of using sand, because at the time, salt was a lot cheaper. It didn't take as much volume to treat the roads, and it was just generally easier. But if we go back to the table here, you can see that pretty much right when, it was pretty flat during the 30s and 40s, and then we start using salt on the roads, and it just has been increasing ever since. And it's very hard to get that out of the system because it just keeps accumulating. So if we keep using salt, it's gonna keep going up, but we also have to balance safety in there as well. And a lot of businesses just would rather have the safety there of over salting than under salting, which causes issues too. So back in the 1950s, WSDOT did adopt a bare pavement policy. So pretty much they wanted every road completely clear after every storm, during every storm. Everything needed to be salted heavily to keep it clean. So once the economic impacts of the oil embargo were felt, that's kind of what forced WSDOT to pull back their policy a little bit. They created different classes of roads, so that the interstates versus the more local roads, and each one of those had different standards that had to be met. So that was more of a cost-cutting measure than anything else. They weren't really looking at salt impacting waterways and stuff like that. There were people who were obviously talking about this and scientists who were raising the issue, but the DOT themselves mainly started cutting back salt as a cost-cutting measure. So in the late 70s, which is what they still use today, is that salt is preventing ice from bonding to the pavement, and it's used after a storm to clean up the ice. So they're not really supposed to be dumping it during the storm. It'll just get run off by cars or other plows. So it's a good way to save costs, and it does save a lot of salt from getting into waterways as well. Another thing you probably see when you're out on the roads is salt brine. This is used to treat the roads beforehand as well as after storms as well. It uses much less salt per treatment mile, and it stays in place much better than the granular salt will as well. This is also something that you could easily make by yourself at your home too. It's just about a quarter rock salt to 3/4 water. So if you wanted to, all you'd have to do is mix those together, and then you could go pre-treat your driveway before a storm. It's pretty easy, but I know most people aren't going to go start doing science experiments to treat their driveway before a storm. So, but it's something to always keep in your mind in case you start seeing issues. One easy way to have an impact is just to stay off the roads while it's snowing. This prevents the snow from being packed down and turned into ice. It lets the plows get through easily and everything get cleared up without using too much salt. It really just keeps everything cleaner, and if everything's cleaner, then the plows are able to just push everything off. So it's always something to keep in mind. I know most people don't like driving in the snow anyways, but obviously if you have to, you have to. So moving on to personal salt usage and what we can do other than just not driving on the roads. Shoveling or otherwise clearing your pavement before putting salt down definitely has a good impact. That just prevents it from freezing into ice in the first place. And if you don't have ice, you don't need salt. One big mistake that people make is that if they don't see the salt like it is in that picture there, then they don't think they've salted enough. Generally, it should be really scattered throughout your driveway or sidewalk. That'll help you get maximum coverage, and you won't be wasting money and time on salt, putting it in piles like this as well. Always make sure that you're using salt that is at the right temperature rating for what it is outside or what the pavement is specifically. Most rock salts are at about 15 degrees. They start becoming not very useful anymore. Once it gets lower than that, you'll have to find a different chemical mixture to put down. An example is just calcium chloride works down to -20 degrees. And it'll generally just say this on the bag that you buy too. So just make sure you're following whatever the manufacturer recommendations are. So if you're using it when it's below the recommended temperature, it's just going to get washed off or shoveled off anyways. So you're kind of wasting your money and your time. Another good key that Trudy and I actually talked about earlier was that you can put sand down to generate traction if that's your main concern. Salt is probably the best idea, but if you don't want to go get a different product for different temperatures, just having a bucket of sand or a bag of sand can really just be used in those circumstances where your salt's not going to work, but you still need traction to walk on your driveway, to drive your car up your driveway, stuff like that. So as we were saying, you don't need a whole lot to properly salt your driveway. So if you think about, you know, how long 60 feet of sidewalk is, and kind of do some mental math there and figure out how big your driveway is, you only need 1 mugful of salt for 60 feet of sidewalk. So that's typically like a 20-foot driveway will come out to that length there. You try to spread it as evenly as you can, because once the salt starts melting the ice and it kind of turns into a liquidy brine, it'll spread out and it'll kind of do the work for you. And then after the storm, a good rule of thumb is that if you see any granular salt at all, so anything that has not melted ice and is still just in its granular form, that means that you salted too much. So every driveway, every sidewalk might be a little different, and it's just working out those kinks by yourself after a storm, and then you kind of get in a routine, and that's the best way to handle it. And if you do have any salt remaining on the sidewalk, it's best to scoop it up, reuse it if you can, or otherwise just dispose of it so it doesn't get washed off into streams or storm sewer or anything like that. So another big item that contributes to our salt output that people don't think of is water softeners. So if you don't know how a water softener specifically works, you'll be putting your salt into the tank, and then that mixes with water to create a brine. From there, The brine is used to flush off resin crystals that are already in your softener. Those resin crystals are what take in all the calcium chloride or other hard minerals that are within the water. So once those resin crystals get full of minerals, they need to be flushed with the salt brine, and the salt brine cleans them off so they can keep doing their job. What happens after that, though, is that brine and hard water mixture is just flushed out to either the sanitary sewer or your own private septic system. Usually people don't really notice that because we just see the soft water coming out. But all that water that's going in there is getting washed out to waste if you're not using it. So that'll go directly to the wastewater treatment plant. And most wastewater treatment plants do not have that reverse osmosis system. That is pretty expensive and takes a lot of time to maintain. And if it doesn't have a system like that to take out the chloride, it just gets washed out into the stream. So this is something year round, not just in the winter, that is constantly putting salt in the environment. And if you have a private septic system, this salt will just infiltrate with the water in your septic field. So if you have a private well nearby, it could potentially get impacted from that. And it's just another way that it's getting released into the environment. So I guess one final note from the 2017 road salt report, which is where I got a lot of the information for the WSDOT items, is that current levels of salt use cannot be sustained without degrading our drinking and surface waters. Private applications on commercial property probably represent the best opportunity for reductions. Practical efforts are proceeding to realize this possibility. So a big impact is that if you own a store or you own some sort of commercial property, you're going to want to put down a ton of salt because you want to remove the liability from yourself. And while we recognize that's the reason for it, if there's ways to reduce salt usage on personal property or commercial property, that's probably the best way that we can get the salt levels to start coming down. With transportation and roads, it's kind of hard to keep that at a balancing level of not using too much or too little to keep the roads safe. But generally, if we can clean off driveways, clean off sidewalks, that's the best way for us to handle keeping the salt levels down. Does anyone have any questions at all? Yep. Yeah, so you could put it down before it snows too. Yeah, so that's what the DOT does, is when they're going out before a storm, they kind of put down salt before the storm to prevent anything from bonding. That would probably be your best bet. Otherwise, yeah, before it snows tonight. Yeah. So either that, or if you can shovel it off and then put salt down, that works too. The key is just that the snow doesn't pack down and turn to a layer of ice there, because then that's where you start to have issues.
I have salt and sand mixed in a bin.
Yep.
But this has been moisture or something that got in it, so the salt's kind of hard. I kind of busted up, so put it down the first time. Does it still work? Yeah, so what the DOT does actually is in the back of salt trucks, they'll pre-wet the salt, and that gets it to actually stick down on the road better. So just having it wet is not going to hurt anything other than having to bust it up and actually make it usable. But it'll still work for using. Yeah, because I almost chop it up. Yeah, and then that sand mixture in there too helps with traction, and that's not going to go away unless it flushes out with the water. So
we're in Madison, and
certain parts.
Mhm.
Where the sand and salt mix, do you guys have that in like?
I do not believe so. But I have heard about that though, where they have, you know, the areas you can go and just
Yeah.
take sand and salt mixtures.
Yeah, so I remember, so when we had these really icy, everything, then there aren't salt anywhere.
Yeah.
Do you have other options? Cause I do my stuff like.
Yeah, so
Salt or whatever.
that's where if you can't find sand or anything at all either, if there's anything that you have on hand that can provide traction, that's probably your best bet. So any sort of, you know, sand or rocks or anything like that that you can put down and it'll kind of give you some footing there, or, you know, for tires as well. Generally, salt or sand was probably your best bet, but if those aren't available, kind of have to be a little creative, I guess.
I think my kids' piano teacher used ashes from her airfield.
That could probably work. I mean, anything that could kind of anything that could probably, you know, keep things stuck together, not make anything slippery or, you know, any sort of organic material like that would work as well. Wood chips, if you have wood chips, you could put those down. Or if you're able to just shovel the snow before, you know, if you have the time to do that, that's probably your best bet to just shovel it before it can turn into ice. Obviously that's not always possible in Wisconsin because we don't know when it's going to snow, but if you can, that's the best bet anytime.
So now that we're more aware, like our girls now have dogs, so now we're probably, you know, like getting pet friendly. So what's the difference with the, do you know what the composition is?
Yeah, I think it's more the regular salt's very jagged. I'm not sure specifically on brands or anything, but that would be my best guess is that they're walking on it with their paw pads and the jagged salt crystals will puncture or stick to them. That'd be my best guess.
Well, thank you so much, Luke, for sharing this information with us. We appreciate it. Keeping our waterways clean and our sidewalks and roads clear. So thank you so much.
Yep.
And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you.